Joining me first is Ragip Soylu, who is the Turkey correspondent for Middle East Eye. We also have Mohammed Marandi, Tehran University professor. Thanks both so much for speaking to us. Ragip, let me start with you. I mean, a detail that may have been lost in a way, but is still so important to note, is that not only did Saudi clearly say at the onset of this tragedy that he left the consulate alive, they also said, okay, he's in Turkey now, and told Turkish authorities, this investigation is kind of your problem. Find him. He left the consulate.
That was a very important turning point for Turkish officials because they were trying to maintain contacts with the Saudi officials and trying to understand what really happened. And then when Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, went on Bloomberg that week and said that it was Turkish officials' responsibility, actually, that he disappeared, Khashoggi disappeared in Istanbul, so they needed to find him. And that really pissed Turkish officials off because, you know, they were still trying to be cordial, trying to understand what really happened, actually give some sort of moment to Saudi officials to, you know, explain themselves. But that didn't happen. After that moment, Turkish officials decided to go to press. And actually, it was kind of hard to go to press as well because a lot of foreign media organizations, they didn't want to publish the details because they didn't believe it. And no one believed it in the first place, actually. If you remember, all of us were in shock. And they were like, you know, did it really happen? Is this like an Islamic State? ISIS is doing this? Or Daesh, how you call it? I don't know. So that was a very important turning point in that time.
It was. And then the Turkish authorities really dug in at that point and said, now we want the truth. And that led to this, as we called it, a slow kind of drip of information. That was, if I can put it this way, was that a strategy that they decided to go with? Because we know that there is some monitoring of foreign authorities and officials in every country around the world. That it happened in Turkey as well. So there was information, there were recordings about what happened, and Turkey was very careful and somewhat calculated about how that information was first monitored and poured over and then released to the public.
Actually, I think Saudis actually made it like this because Turkish officials were, you know, giving the necessary, the relevant data, the information to media, but they weren't giving the full account because they didn't need to in the first place. But if you remember, once Turkey was leaking something, Saudis were coming up with another excuse, and then Turks were coming up another explanation with proof showing that they were lying. So eventually it became like this drip by drip strategy because Saudis underestimated Turks a lot. They didn't understand the fact that Turkish intelligence and the Turkish security forces are hugely capable inside Turkey. And they have bugged the place, even though Saudi intelligence thoroughly searched the place. They couldn't find the bugs. And then this eventually has become some sort of a game between Turkish officials and the Saudi officials. But the fact still stands that the Saudi officials repeatedly, over and over, lied about the motive, lied about how it was conducted, lied about the officials involved in this assassination. And they basically lost the trust in international community, international media as well.
And Ragip, I mean, remind us why it is so disturbing that Saudi kind of tried to play this anyway. And remember that they didn't let the Turkish authorities into the consulate to investigate until weeks after the crime was committed. Saudi tried to play this off as that this is our sovereign territory. This is our consulate. You have no business entering here. Turkey really had to fight to say, no, this is a crime committed on our sovereign territory, despite this building belonging to Saudi authorities. How was that reconciled? How was it able that Turkey was allowed to continue with an investigation? Because it blurs diplomatic lines.
I think the international pressure a lot played a role, but actually, if you realize that they had this so-called, you know, security teams coming in, actually supposedly helping the Turkish investigators, but we realized later on that those, you know, aid sent by Saudis were actually the people who were there to clean the area, basically remove all the evidence that the Turkish officials wouldn't find. So I think they needed to arrange that, you know, trip for the Saudi officials to come and to clean the place. And then with the help of the international pressure and the, you know, like the officials from the UN and especially the American government basically started to speak up about this issue, compelled Saudi officials to basically allow Turkish officials in. But as I said, once Turkish officials were in, it was actually the whole place was cleaned. You know, it was even painted.
Okay, I'm going to switch gears and speak to Mohammed now and see and talk a little bit about the Iranian perspective on this, because as we know, Saudi had become kind of the regional favorite of some other world powers, mainly the United States. This event seemed to shed a light on Saudi that this is not an honest broker, and that this alliance you're forming with the kingdom against Iran is lose-lose, basically. Tell us how this case actually changed Iran's stance here in the region.
I think this is an argument that actually began a long time ago when the Saudis and the United States together were creating terrorist groups in Pakistan for the Afghani war going on in the 1980s, where the Soviets had occupied the country. And Iranians, as well as many others, were saying that spreading terrorism, spreading extremism is ultimately going to come back and hit you hard. There will be blowback. And then it came in during 9/11, after 9/11. There was a lot of thinking going on in the United States that this was a problem or a tragedy that had been created partially by the United States itself. But after a couple of years, that sort of disappeared, that new narrative. It got lost in the war on terror. And again, gradually the United States began to cooperate with these extremist groups, as we saw later on in the last decade. But this particular instance, I think, not only reignited the question of Saudi Arabia, but it did it in a very extraordinary way. And you raised that question with one of your reporters. Why was this so big? And it's very hard to explain because, for example, what the Saudis are doing in Yemen is infinitely more horrific. But the way Jamal was killed, not only the fact that it was in a consulate, but also because Jamal had served, I mean, I've known him for years. We've debated a lot, we disagreed a lot. He defended Saudi Arabia for decades, and even Mohammed bin Salman should have been very grateful to someone like him, despite his criticisms. But the fact that they would do this to such a person, I mean, if it was done to me, I think it would be more understandable.
No. It is so important that you mentioned that point, because he was a proud Saudi man. He was a palace insider, and it was only towards the very end that he became critical of Mohammed bin Salman, because he just thought he was going just too far with his arresting certain activists in Saudi Arabia, calling them terrorists, when Khashoggi was saying these are not terrorists. You know, these are just people who are expressing an opinion. They do not deserve to be locked up. But what was it then that actually made Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudi kingdom fear him going forward? Do you think this was a preemptive killing, that they were just scared of what he might do in the future because they were going to continue down the path they were on?
It's hard to say what goes on in the mind, obviously, of any person, let alone someone like Mohammed bin Salman. But my own theory is that Mohammed bin Salman was born a billionaire. He is not of the previous generation of the Saudi family, where they did have a tough time before oil. They were ruthless in gaining power and so on, but they were not born billionaires. He was born and brought up very wealthy, yes men around him, even as a child, I'm sure. And we've seen from the beginning when he came to power how he's been making foolish moves one after another. For example, when he invited the investors, and then the week later at the Ritz, he turned it into a prison for the princes. I mean, what do you think the investors are going to think about that? Then kidnapping the Lebanese prime minister, beating him, someone who was connected to the Saudis.
Absolutely.
Then, you know, Yemen, Qatar, the Doha was friendly to Saudi Arabia, and then this in Turkey, and so on. And the fact that he keeps repeating these stupid and foolish mistakes or crimes or whatever we'd like to label them, I think shows that no one either is willing to give him real advice or he is unable to change.
Okay. Ragip, let me finish with you. I mean, 2 days ago, we saw the Washington Post editorial that President Erdogan wrote to remind the world that it's been a year and we're not going to stop. We saw this very touching ceremony today in Istanbul with very high-profile global people joining to honor Jamal Khashoggi. Saudi wants this forgotten. It hopes that time will just kind of bury this under the rug. People will get tired of it. So what really is in the cards, particularly for Turkey, to make sure that this doesn't get swept under the rug?
I think an indictment should be announced soon, and the indictment would be an interesting factor that would actually draw the attention, international attention further, because it would include some parts of the Saudi investigation as well, so we would understand at least to some parts that what they are really thinking or doing over there. At the same time, Turkey is trying to get the United Nations involved in the process as well. Of course, we had Agnes Kalamar's, the UN rapporteur's report about the assassination, but then Turkey also demands that the UN Security Council Secretary General authorizing a commission to take care of this issue and get the bottom of it, because just a rapporteur from the United Nations Human Rights Commission is not enough. You have to have the United Nations Security Council to formalize the whole process. And Turkey is trying to do both the UN and then the Turkey's own indictment. And the fact that Turkey is not bowing down the Saudi pressure, if you look at the fact that there are calls of Saudi government to prevent Saudi tourists to visit Turkey. There are disinvestment calls. There are always, every day almost, hashtags, anti-Erdogan, anti-Turkey hashtags on Saudi social media propped up by the Saudi government. So it's already, it's standing its ground, so receiving this pressure from the Saudi government.
Okay. Ragip, Soylu, Mohammed, Marandi, I'll let you get out of the sun here. Thank you both so much for joining us and sharing your insight on this solemn day.